Alright, so welcome to episode 2 of the Knowledge Hole. Today we have Mr. Vincent.
Hello.
So you were a housemaster for Cranbourne for how
12
many
years.
12 years.
12
Before
years.
that you were at Bryanston.
Yeah, a long time before then. I was at Bryanston at school between 1982 and 1987. And then I was 17 years away one way or the other, university, the army, various other things. And then I came back here in 2003, and then I took over Cranbourne in 2005, yeah.
Why did you come back?
Why did I come back? I think it's fair to say that when I left school, if you'd have told me that I would have been a teacher of any sort, I would have laughed in your face. If you told me I would have come back to my old school, I would have laughed in your face twice. But life has a funny habit of doing this, and after coming out of the army and deciding to be a teacher, I taught for 3 years in the Midlands at Loughborough Grammar School. And it was a great school, but it was a day school, and it was just a little bit missing for me from what I remembered from what was a very happy time for me at school. And when the job came up here, a history job, I applied for it. Luckily, I got it. And then I had 2 years just teaching history before Mr. Purgos, who used to do the rugby here, retired from Cranbourne, and that's when I stepped in. So, yeah, and there were about 27 people, teachers, who were teachers when I was here, including the headmaster.
Oh, right.
But I think they all didn't really recognise me or remember me that well. Only one guy did, Alan Shrimpton. He used to be a biology teacher here and go down to the boathouse a lot. He did remember me because his only comment was he came up to me and said, "I can't believe they employed you." So from that point onwards, that set me on my time here.
Alright, so what was it like being like when you're a pupil and you come back straight away? So we have obviously Cam coming back, being a pupil, and then I mean you had a big break, so obviously it's a bit different, but
yeah, it's a bit different. 17 years away. It wasn't that I didn't want to come back during that time. It's just my 10-year reunion. I was in the army. I got sent abroad. So I had that break. To be honest, and it'll be interesting to see what you guys say in a few years' time, having spoken to people from other schools, I think if there's a school that's quite easy to come back to from the point of view of fitting in with people who used to be your teachers, here is probably easier than most places.
yeah.
And I think that's probably because there's a lot more sort of regular conversations and interaction between staff and pupils than you would get in a more formal school. For example, at Loughborough Grammar School, as I say, great school, but every time I, as a teacher in my suit with my cape on, would walk down a corridor, all the boys would flatten themselves against the wall as I sort of swept past or leap to their feet. And that for me is great and it's traditional, but it doesn't really build that sort of relationship, I think, that would make it an easy environment to come back into.
Could have just been because you're quite scary.
It could. I'm not sure that's the case. It was just the tradition of the play. It was a very traditional school, but it could be my scariest year.
So,
yeah.
so you were here in like the 80s, right?
82 to 87, yeah.
So obviously it's a completely different time now with phones and everything.
Yep.
But stuff like if we're pupils here now, so we have health and safety things, so we can't do half the stuff.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, in the 1980s, I think there were 5 computers in the whole school that we could access. There were some in the bursary, but they were BBC computers that you had to write the code for. That's kind of come full circle because people are doing that again. And they had cassette players that you could put games like Space Invaders into. But obviously no phones. Most houses didn't have a TV. Even if you did have a TV, there was only 4 TV channels you could possibly access. And so I think as a result, people were much keener when I was here to go and do other stuff, and particularly to be outside a lot. I think we had a lot more free time, if we're honest. People checked up on us less. That wasn't just here. I think that was every boarding school in the 80s. But you did have the time, is what I remember, to go and do the things, either the good things or the bad things that you wanted to. But for example, when we went to play music, do band music and things, there was a band room down by the Greek Theatre, and you just went down there and made your own music. And if you wanted to do a concert, you had to get all your own PA and set it up and do your own sound checks and provide your own microphones. And so it was a lot more amateurish than it is now. But I think in a way we probably learnt a little bit more, shall we say.
So after you finished Bryanston, did you know you were going to go straight into the military?
No, not at all.
Did you do anything in between?
Yeah, well, I did. I had a year off where I worked our local sort of place. I lived in the New Forest, and my brother and I both worked at Beaulieu Motor Museum, which was a great employer for young people, you know, driving the monorail and, you know, socialising. I then did 3 years at university, and then after that I thought I wanted to go and work in the city, which I tried. I was terrible at it. So I lasted about 3 months, and then I saw an advert to be a rowing coach on a reconstructed ancient Greek trireme in the Greek islands.
Wow.
So I then spent 3 months living on a Greek naval base in the island of Poros and taking this ancient Greek warship with 178 oarsmen. It was fantastic fun. We rowed from like 6 a.m. till 10 because otherwise it was too hot.
That sounds ridiculous.
And then we went on the beach and swam in the sea, and then we went clubbing every night. Got to bed about 4, and then got up again at 6 and went rowing again. And then I came back from that, and I thought, I still quite don't know what I want to do. We had friends who ran a farm in Zambia. I flew out there with Aeroflot, which was the old Russian air carrier. It was terrible. I have to say, it's one of the most terrible flights I've ever made. Stopped off in Moscow, Malta, Angola. There was a civil war going on at the time, and got there. And anyway, I ended up staying for ages as a farm manager. So, and then I came back from there and thought I really ought to do something a little bit more sensible. Went and did my RCB, which is Army Selection thing. Went to Sandhurst, and that was that chapter of my career. But it was about time to do something proper.
May I ask?
Yeah.
What inspired you to join the army? Like, was there a certain thing, or did you see an advert for it? Or?
No, I mean, it's one of those really annoying things that you guys will get later in your life. Teaching is similar, actually. It's those things that your mother always says you would be good at, and you always resist that because it's your mum who's said it to you.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like, so my mum said, oh, you'd be a really good teacher. I'm never being a teacher. And she said, a lot of my family have been in the Navy, actually. My dad was a naval doctor. So that's one of the reasons I came to school here is back then the Navy or the Army would just pay a flat 50% of your fees. It was a lot less expensive back then as well. So a lot of my family had been in the Navy. It was a little bit what my mum wanted, but just to get my own back, I made it the Army rather than the Navy or the Marines, just so I could say that bit was mine. So it was a great decision for me because I was a little bit unsure about what direction I was going in, and it really focused that in a bit.
So what was your... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go.
What was your first deployment in the army?
I first went to Bosnia, which was about a week after I passed out of Sandhurst. Passed out as in the parade rather than, we passed out of Sandhurst, had a little party, and then immediately began our beat up to go. And within a week, I found myself in Vitez in the middle of Bosnia with 4 armoured vehicles, 35 blokes who were looking to me to normally tell them what to do, and 2 sergeants, or a platoon sergeant, a warrior sergeant, both of whom had been in the army for about 10 years plus, who are much more knowledgeable and much more experienced than me. So that was a pretty steep learning curve. And Bosnia at the time that I was there was in the middle of a 3-way civil war between the Croats, the Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims. And during my 6 month, it moved to more of a sort of 2-way conflict because the Croats and the Muslims made an alliance, and it went there. But it was that sort of horrendous, messy peacekeeping operation that one's involved in, sat in a white vehicle trying to stop people from killing each other.
So what would you do?
Were you NATO bodyguards? Was that what?
No. NATO came along later. I can't remember the exact date, but when I was there, it was just UN. So the British Army had lent troops to the UN. I think later, if sometime you do one of these with Mr. Mortimer, he was there during that period where I think his first 3 months was with the UN and the second 3 months was with NATO. Okay. So they switched roles because the UN pulled out and NATO stepped in. It's when the Americans decided to get involved, basically, which is when things actually started happening a bit more. Because the UN's a fantastic organisation unless you want to get things done quickly. If you want things done quickly, the UN, in my experience, wasn't fantastic at that. But you'd just be doing joint patrols, liaising with local people, mounting vehicle checkpoints, escorting aid convoys through to make sure that they got through to where they were going. So it was really exciting at the time. I made the mistake of sort of phoning my mother up and telling her about the excitement of being shot at a couple of times, which didn't go down well with my mother. But then you don't think about those things when you're in your 20s. Although I have to say what it did do is to, and I'm going to avoid being political here, it made me appreciate the value of mixed societies living together. It made me incredibly fearful of the damage that nationalism and people wanting to identify scapegoats and target particular groups. So I think it was a real sort of seminal moment in that way, because one could see, again, being a historian, this is how things start. Yeah. How things start is when you start seeing other people as less worthy than you. And that's the dangerous step. And once you've taken that step, the valley downwards is pretty steep, actually. And that's why current things, both this side and the other side of the Atlantic, sort of slightly concern me at the moment.
Yeah.
Shall I say?
When you were out in the military, do you think any of your sort of, obviously because you were going out young and then you come out 5 years later, so you gain a lot of experience, but do you because I've read up on it a little bit, people go out to the military, they'll go on tours to Afghanistan, and then their whole view on society, on everything completely changes?
I think it depends where you go. I mean, I have to say, although I probably would have liked the challenge of Afghanistan when I was in my 20s, I mean, the thought of going out there in my 40s or now in my 50s terrifies me. But I think the thing there is that was a much more, I think there was more an identifiable enemy in Afghanistan, and I think that would have a very different effect on a young man or woman in that environment, because there's a perceived threat there the whole time. I think Bosnia was a little bit, not more difficult at all. I think it was much easier and certainly far less dangerous. My 6 months out there, we lost one guy, Steve Wormold, who was a captain, who was a liaison officer, and that's because his driver took a wrong turning and hit a landmine. But it's not like when my regiment then went out to Afghanistan in 2005, I think they lost about 19 people or something along that. I'd left by then a long time. But I think different environments can have a different effect on you. And I wouldn't ever say that it has the same. But for me, I think it made me less nationalistic, as it were. Not that I was ever particularly. For others, it might make them more. I think it's an individual experience. Yeah. But it certainly was an experience that changed me.
Yeah. Was it quite different coming from Bryanston, which is almost quite a liberal place, which has been known to be liberal, into the army, and surely there's different views there from everyone?
I don't think there's different views. I think you take a slightly different approach to it. I think in that, one, I've been to Bryanston, and two, I went in sort of slightly older than most. So I was 24, sort of nearly 25 when I went in. And I don't know in what mixture that made a difference, but I think what it did do was when in your first term, they basically your first 4 or 5 weeks, they try and break you down. So you run everywhere and you stay up, you get about 2 hours sleep a night, and you've got to make your bed perfectly. So I just made my bed and slept on the floor because it seemed to me less trouble than making my bed every morning. But I think I approached that with a little bit of not that I would ever say anything, but a little bit saying, yeah, I can see what you're trying to do. Not, getting into the depths of worry and despair about it. And maybe that's a little bit of the Bryanston thing, and maybe it isn't. But I think the automatic of just doing what somebody tells you to do because that's what you've been used to wasn't really something that Bryanston prepared me particularly well for. Well, I'm quite glad about that, but it did make certain things a little bit more challenging.
Did you ever read up on that? It was the US soldier who went out to Afghanistan, and then he went out with his platoon or something like that, and then he was the only one that survived. And then because you read about you two read up about that, didn't you? I can't remember his name or anything, but he went out and he was like, he described himself as a sort of like a fighter. He just wanted to go out and go fight and just go fight for his country. And then he sort of watched all his like close friends just pass away by his side. And then he came out and he had a completely different like view on society, and sort of he went back into the normal world, and he found it like, I think he just found it really hard to like readjust kind of.
Well, I think somebody, if he really was somebody who really liked that kind of thing, my experience of people even, you know, in the army was that only a very small percentage of people who actually want that sort of confrontation and violence and a fight. There are people out there. I mean, there are. I had a driver who was like it, who was a nightmare. Or certainly if he'd had a drink, he was. Most people, I think, are doing it because I think people's primary motivation in the army, and I'm sure in the Navy and the RAF as well, in that sort of environment, isn't anything to do with anything really more than your responsibilities and your friends. Actually, you know, you'll always get people who just want to go and you know, rage it up a little bit. I don't happen to think that they make particularly effective soldiers in the environment that I was in. I'm sure if you're storming the beaches of D-Day, that's great. But if you're looking for people who are going to be measured and try and keep the peace. But I think it's something that, I mean, the other thing I think that people misjudge about the army is that they think it's all about action. Somebody once said, and I can't remember who it was, that the army is 99% boredom and 1% terror. And there's a lot of boredom, there's a lot of preparing for things. But in order to keep things for that, and this is what I realised during my time in the army, most of my time was spent looking after young soldiers and teaching them. They might be slightly different lessons, but it really was, you know, young men often who you know, got into financial trouble, got into things like that. And you spend most of your time in a camp somewhere, trying to keep these guys on the straight and narrow, trying to keep, you know, everyone on the straight and narrow. And I think that's when it first started, those annoying words of my mother's started coming back to me, that actually teaching was something that I quite enjoyed, as long as it wasn't in a kind of, I'm going to tell you what to think environment. And that's what I suppose made me start thinking about it. Because teaching is sort of about shared experience, I think, as much as just telling people what to do and write and think, and trying to get people there themselves. But hey.
Yeah, because Finn, you're looking at being in the army.
Yeah, I considered it, and have you got any words to say for it?
I would. Apologies, Mrs. Rawlings, if you're out there somewhere, because this isn't a conversation that tends to go down well with people's mamas. Do you know what? I'm so grateful for what the army allowed me to become. And I won't say what the army made me, because I don't think it did. And I think it's, you know, I was in the army and then I left. And it's not something that defines me for the rest of my life, but it did change my experience, and gave me a sense of purpose, gave me a sense of responsibility, gave me a sense of service, actually. You know, the motto of Sandhurst, and I'll do a bit of advertising here, serve to lead, is absolutely right. The first lesson you ever do at Sandhurst is how to inspect other people's feet. Because if your soldiers can't march because their feet are gone, they're no use to anyone. And you know, there is that aspect there that you are there, yes, to command men, but also to look after them. And I think if I had my time again, I would do exactly the same thing. Because I think it gives you that discipline in your own life, focus, and experience that means that actually a lot of the problems that life throws you after that, you can meet with a little bit more confidence. Yeah, I think. Yeah. So I'd do the same again, but it's not for everyone.
Was there any
couple
times...
you might need a haircut.
Was there any times where you thought that maybe while you're in the army that wasn't something you wanted to do? Because for me personally, I've thought about whether I could possibly like join the army, but for me the problem is that I personally think war is wrong.
Yeah.
I hate the idea of it, and I think that if I was to join the army, I'd be contributing to violence. Which I wouldn't necessarily be doing that, but in a way, for me, it just feels slightly against.
Yeah, I mean,
what I believe.
I accept that. But I suppose at the end of the day, conflict is a reality, and if one sees oneself as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And that's certainly, what I did. I don't believe in sort of, violence in this country, but somebody has to go and sort it out. And I think probably in the era that I was in with things like Northern Ireland and Bosnia, it was a lot more that. It was going in to try and be a mitigating factor to try and sort of calm things down where you could. Possibly my experience and my views would be different if I had actually gone out to an environment where I was fighting a war and trying to take somebody else's life, which I wasn't primarily. That was just something that wasn't the motivation. I think even if you get to that situation, I don't agree with war either. I think war's a terrible way of solving things. But war is a reality. I'll bore you now with Clausewitz, because I teach this at A level. Clausewitz, the famous military theorist, said war is simply a continuation of politics by other means. So politics is about people trying to get their views across. When they stop talking, they start fighting. And I think as long as you have politics and as long as you have differences of opinion, there is always going to be the ultimate sanction of violence of one sort or another to bring that to its conclusion. And for what it's worth, I think a modern world where certain issues are becoming more heated and people are so devoid of fair-minded assessments of things, I think for your generation it's very difficult because there are so many media outlets targeting you. You don't know which to believe and which not. And I think that although we have so much information now, people probably know less.
This was harder.
It's harder. It's harder to distinguish the fake from the real.
And everyone can give their opinion on everything.
Yeah, everyone can give their opinion. And if you choose to, you can have a sounding board that, in media terms, that just reflects your views. We've seen this with Brexit, haven't we? If you are a Brexit supporter, you read a Brexit supporting newspaper and you say that anything that isn't Brexit supporting is fake news. If you're a Remain supporter, you only read newspapers. So people are just reading stuff that reinforce their views, and that means that people entrench their positions. And that kind of thing actually makes war and violence more likely, because you do that for long enough and you start to see other people's opinions as being not valid and something that needs to be fought against. And we've had this rhetoric being used. Sorry, I'm going over into teaching and politics now, but there we go.
No, we discussed something like that last week, like the whole sort of fake news idea.
Yeah.
Do any of you think that kind of like happens in like the sort of like Bryanston bubble, like people just form an opinion and then?
I mean, I think for Bryanston it doesn't happen as much as perhaps outside of Bryanston, because here people I've noticed are quite open to accept other people's opinions and just not take that much offence. But even still, especially like there are certain people who just won't accept anything you say, even if you're being perfectly reasonable, understanding. There's nothing you can do to change, and you're maybe not even trying to change their opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to bear in mind, I'm not trying to be patronising here, but I'm probably going to sound patronising, that partly that's part of being a teenager, because you're basically trying out, opinions. I'm not saying you're not doing it perfectly legitimately, but, I mean, we come back to parents again, isn't it? You want to try and think something that's slightly different. You want to do something that's slightly challenging, and that can lead people to take, retrenched positions and not want to retreat from it. I've got 3 teenage children. I understand that. It's it's one of those things. But it's interesting you raise this thing about the Bryanston bubble, because sort of slight flashback to what we were talking about with me being at school here. I tell you what, it's a hell of a lot more of a bubble back then.
Really?
Hell of a lot more
with
of a
no
bubble.
social media or anything.
We had no social media. I mean, it struck me.
You send letters. And
it struck me on Saturday with that sort of block fixture against Camford. When we played Camford, although Sherburn were more of a rival back then, I don't know. But when you met these kids, my only experience, because I didn't go to a prep school round here, I didn't go to prep school, I was in a school over sort of Portsmouth way. We could really see them as being different and other, and that's the only environment And what struck me after pretty much all the matches is that everybody was going up afterwards and chatting to each other because you all know each other. If you weren't, even if you weren't at prep school together, you communicate. You go into the same parties. You go to the same. You're on the same social media things. So that thing to see, Canford people as Canford people and Sherburn people as Sherburn people. Just, I know people get really silly about these fixtures, but in my view, by and large, not the players.
Yeah.
Isn't that? I mean, parents can get a bit silly about it.
I
Some
know.
staff can get a bit silly about it.
I think
but
the
you
players-
guys all know each other, don't you?
I think the players, it's almost superficial about like the hate, the almost hatred against the other schools.
But it's a false construct, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's a false construct.
Also, do people hate each other not hate, but not like the other team is more?
I don't think so. I mean, there wasn't the same amount of do you know one thing? This is going retrograde because we're going back to my school days. And one of the things that made sort of things like rugby in my day a hell of a lot easier was that parents didn't didn't come and watch. And it's remarkable how much pressure that takes off a match. And I had a prep school parent at one of our prep school sevens things last year come and say, what do you think could make prep school sport better with rugby? And I said, I think they should ban all parents from the touchline. Because, you've got some dads standing there saying, pass the ball to Freddie. Why is nobody passing Freddie the ball? And you just sort of leave them alone and let them play the game. And I think we were allowed to do that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But sometimes that pressure does almost help give the match a little bit more of an edge, because especially in winter where the weather's not very good, no one doesn't really want to play, some people, and that pressure from everyone else who's trying to play their best and from the parents can give it a bit more edge.
Of course it can, yeah.
I think that kind of comes when you get older towards senior school. I mean, if you're at prep school, because all your parents live local. So like George, when you were at Sandroyd or whatever playing a match, you probably want to like.
Yeah, I was like, Ginny, just leave me alone.
She never has.
Yeah, she still hasn't. But like, I'm come to.
Is Ginny going to listen to this, George?
He knows.
No.
Like, I've come to accept it now. But at prep school, I was like, just please don't come to my matches. It's embarrassing and stuff. But like now, I feel it's a bit of like support, and yeah, it's just like.
I think it's fine to be supportive, and I think that's really great. I'm not saying I don't actually mean that parents shouldn't come, but I think if they are going to come. They should just be supportive of the fact that
they get too into it sometimes.
Well, the fact is, let's keep a sense of perspective. It's a game between two groups of schoolboys or schoolgirls, right? Yeah. It's not the World Cup final. Yeah. Yeah. It's not the be-all and end-all. Everybody's going to go away afterwards and do whatever. So, and everybody wants everybody to leave and be safe and not be hurt and all of that sort of thing. So, I think it's great if it's done constructively. Anyway, I didn't mean to get onto criticism, but there we go. And that again, you see a different side when you come back to a school, as I did, come back to the school that I was at, and then you've got to start. I tell you what really scars you from that point of view is refereeing.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Wow. That is... having said that, I'd far rather be a rugby referee than a football one.
Oh yeah, definitely. They're so much more respectful in rugby.
Well, I just think, if you're going to take on rugby as well, I think learning to be a referee is a really good thing to learn the game as well. But hey.
Well, I think it's kind of like with all sports though. With anything really, if you get like the sense of like kind of superiority. Well, for your perspective anyway. Yeah. So you were a schoolboy like shouting at a ref one time, and then now you're looking at.
Oh no! I've got to stop you there because in my day you did not shout at refs.
Okay.
Yeah. I got. Well, we didn't have yellow cards back in my day, and tries were worth less, and it was like playing in the Victorian era. Not quite that. No, I got sent off once when I was 15, and it's because somebody stood on my foot, and I said shit, and I was sent off for bad language.
Ooh,
okay, wow. And that was so you talk back to the referee at all in my day, and no. It wouldn't have happened. So there was none of that at all.
Why has it got so lenient then? Do you think it's
we'd have no players left?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but this is the thing, in the perspective of being a referee, and we're getting a bit sidetracked down into rugby here, aren't we? The referee is somebody who's giving up their afternoon to make sure that two groups of kids can have a game. Yeah. And that's the thing you need to bear in mind, isn't it? If the referee's not there, you can't have your game, and you can't enjoy yourself. So I have to say, when I first started coaching back at school at Loughborough and a little bit here, I'd get a bit, heated with referees. In the last 10 years, you've probably got some examples of where that wasn't the case, in which case I'm perjuring myself. But I've far more just tried to keep my mouth shut and then go up afterwards and say thank you very much. Now, I might be enormously frustrated with what's happening.
There's no use in arguing with.
There's no use, is there? And, you know, it just makes people feel uncomfortable. But hey-ho.
Do you think that is mainly like the reason why people sort of, well, it's the classic footballer, like fake their injury, do the diving and stuff? Or do you think they'll, like, for example, a 14-year-old watching like Cristiano Ronaldo like shout at a ref, do you think they'll see that and then?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And that's, you know, that sort of brings us back to the kind of teaching thing, I suppose, in a way, isn't it? Is that people follow the example that they've been set. And particularly young children. Doesn't mean they follow it slavishly, but you know, you have to try and portray the sort of behaviour that you would wish your children, if you have children, or your pupils to follow. You know, you can't expect respect and not give it. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So you know, I'm a firm believer, for example, in the fact that everybody should hold the door open for everybody, whether you're, you know, a D kid or a deputy head or whatever. There's no automatic thing there. You've got to, you know, it's a two-way process. I'm not saying that everybody's on an equal level at all, but if you want people to be polite and if you want people to be considerate, you need to show them what politeness and consideration is. Otherwise, how are they going to learn that that's a desirable thing to be? Do you see what I mean?
That's definitely true.
Yeah. It's a two-way process. And you know, this is the teaching thing, isn't it? And it's, I mean, I'm sure we'll come to Cranbourne in a minute, but do you know what, the best part of the year for me is when, and you guys will have this next summer, is when you have the speech day, everybody else goes away. It's just A2 left, although they're not A2 anymore because they've left the school. They come back, we have a reception before the Leavers Ball, and, you know, the kind of veil between you comes down because the A2s are now adults in their own right. And that's what I liked at Bryanston when I was here, and it's certainly what I like about teaching there, because that doesn't feel awkward at that reception. I don't stay for the Leavers Ball because it's too long, too late, everything like that. But when that veil comes down, it's not a drama at all to see the people that you're talking to as being adults in their own right, because you've been building up to that point over 5 years. Particularly with your tutorial pupils, you know, they've come and sat down and you've had a bit of a go at them and you've tried to tell them to do more work for their GCSEs and you've given them a bit of guidance for this. And at the end of the day, if we're trying to do anything that's worthwhile, it's to produce decent 18-year-olds who are going to go out into the world and be happy talking to anyone and be comfortable and be confident in their own skin and things like that. So, you know, that for me, I think, is the key. And I sort of go on about this too much, and I think some schools can get this wrong. You know, you have the great privilege to go to a school where you get lots of advantages, but that doesn't make you something. And I don't like the being an old something-onian. Idea. I think that's where it can become arrogance, isn't it? If your confidence is based simply on the fact that you've been somewhere that isn't you, you know, if you can wear your tie and say, this makes me this kind of person, that can quickly turn into arrogance. I think confidence without arrogance is being confident in who you are as an individual, and that involves that engagement over years, really.
I completely, I really like just respect the sort of like Bryanston ethos, because I don't mean to like put down other schools, whatever, but so I have 3 brothers and they've all been to similar private schools. So 2 went to Marlborough, 1 went to Sherborne, and the sort of Marlborough mentality is form you into your old Marlburian. Look at all these old Marlburians. We have Bear Grylls and stuff like that. But it's all just a formula, and sometimes it doesn't work. And you went to Camford, and Camford's a little less like that. But in a way, it can, compared to Bryanston, it still is a little bit of a formula.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah.
Did you find that, or?
Yeah, I would say it's quite similar. Like, I still think it is trying to get you to that, just like the best you can be almost. Yeah. I think with Camp, they look for you more academically than here. Like I said, it's a bit more relaxed here. I know for me it works better here because I'm not the most academic, and then Camp, they really did want the absolute best out of you and nothing but that. That's what.
Yeah, I mean, I think everywhere's changed a little bit, but this kind of thing about identity was formed at a time where that identity was important, and you could get into that gentleman's club in London if you wore your old school tie, and you could get into that law firm if you did that. But I think to hold on to that too much in the current day and age is a little bit of a disservice to people, actually, because I think those kind of jobs don't really exist anymore.
Yeah, but the old Bryanstonian
outside
scheme,
Parliament,
the old Bryanstonian scheme is quite influential in gaining contacts.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying don't celebrate being an old boy of the school, but don't think that means that you are something. It means that you have a shared experience.
There's no divine right to
No, there's no divine right. It's just that you happen to be one of the incredibly fortunate people who's managed to make the most of that, and that goes for Marlborough or Camford or whatever. It's about being enormously grateful for the opportunities that you've been given. And I have to say, it's one of the reasons why I quite like the fact that I've just been doing interviews for people coming into the sixth form, that I like that process, because you often get a lot of people who come and say, I'm really fortunate to be here and I'm going to make the most of it. And that's a nice contrast from people who sort of take it all for granted, if you know what I mean. I think that's quite a good process as well.
I mean, I hate to change the subject, but can we talk about Cranbourne?
Yes, you can. Yeah,
we got 5 minutes left.
Oh, we've only got 5 minutes.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes
on the board.
You were a teacher for 2 years before Cranbourne.
For 2 years, yeah.
And then you suddenly had all this responsibility of all of these boys. What was that like?
Absolutely terrifying. It was really... What made it easier in my first year is that only 2 boys out of 40 had mobile phones.
Oh, yeah.
If one thing has changed housemastering and housemistressing, I think, over the last 10, 15 years, it's been mobile phones. I better explain that. I think there's a really good but very rude Australian comedian called Jim Jeffries. I don't know if you've ever come across him. He does a fantastic bit on gun control, which you mustn't listen to because it's frightfully rude. But in it, he says, look, gun control would make sense if everybody only had a musket. Yeah. Because the thing with a musket is it takes you so long to load that you have a good time to think about it before you pull the trigger. Now, when I was at school here, and even when I came back to being a housemaster, you had a phone in Cranbourne. It was where those cupboards are, sort of opposite that room. And if you wanted to, you'd had a hard time, and you wanted to phone up your mum and say what a hard time you had to get some 10p pieces and you had to queue up. And usually by the time you got to the phone, you're like, nah.
And everyone around you can hear you.
And everyone around you can hear you.
Being a D-boy in a house, I mean, I know personally, I wouldn't have done that.
No,
I wouldn't have phoned my parents.
And I think, because now it's so instantaneous, and how many times over my 12 years in Cranbourne that I'd have a phone call in my office from somebody's parent saying, so-and-so's frightfully upset. And I'd look out the door, see them running around, jumping on each other, having a wonderful time. Because what they'd done is phoned up their mum, offloaded all their negativity on their mobile phone, and then just got on with life and gone and had a game of pool. Well, all the time their mother was going bonkers and phoning me up saying they're having a horrid time. Whereas actually, if they just waited half an hour, and I'm not saying don't talk to your parents, by the way, I'm just saying, it's the filter, isn't it? It's where you go through. But yeah, looking after people was really concerning, and I would say the same thing to the people who came in as my stripes every year, honestly, which was, and I don't know what they do now, which was that, boys and girls, A3s would come in to be stripes in the junior boys' house, and I would say to them, look, I'm not expecting you to be my personal Stasi or Gestapo or whatever it might be, but I just need one thing from you, which is if these guys are doing something really dangerous or stupid, please can you either stop them or let me know straight away, because the only thing that used to keep me up at night was having to make that phone call to somebody's parents that nobody ever wants to have. And you think that's being a little bit over dramatic, but you guys will remember, my God, D-boys can do stupid things.
What was the craziest thing that someone did?
There was, I can't name names, can I? One boy who decided that he would spray 3 deodorant cans into his underbed locker and try and set fire to it.
Tell me about this.
And burnt the whole front of his hair and face off and tried to tell me he'd burnt it on a kettle. There was a big not particularly coordinated lad who'd assured everyone in the house that he could do a backflip off the fence in the Cranbourne garden. And I came through and I saw him with this crowd around him chanting. And it was like time slowed down as I tried to sprint for the back door. He tried to do the backflip and landed on his neck. And I was just thinking... Because even if you're not making that horrid call to somebody's parent, you know, you're in a car on your way to A&E on a Saturday night in Poole, surrounded by drunk people, and you're there for 6 hours because somebody's done something enormously stupid. You know, boys who would try and freeze their nipples with deodorant and flick them off. You know, this is just the top of the kind of fractionating column of stupidity. And that's fine. That's what being a teenage boy, a D-boy is like. And it struck, you'd always ask them, you know, what were you thinking of? And they'd go, nothing. And they weren't lying to you. They'd been completely honest because they literally weren't thinking about anything.
Well, I'm in Strive at the moment, and one night I came up, and just one of the walls in Cranbourne just had loads of holes in it.
Yeah.
And they'd just been hitting it with ping pong bats. Like, just smashing the wall with ping pong bats.
Why?
And I was like, why'd you do that? They were like,
because it seemed like a good idea at the time. Yeah. Well, it's, you know, it's the thing, isn't it? I mean, look what happens every time there's frost or snow on the ground. I don't need to go any further with that one, do I? But, you know, every year it's the same. Or we're going to run up and shut the door before the next person comes in, and then we'll rattle on the door of Cranbourne for a while. You know, all those great things. And when you're in the moment, it's the most hilarious thing in the world. And then there's cynical me going, oh, God, this has happened for each of the last 11 years. Mm-hmm. But it is enjoyable, and I do have to say I did, because you my last year when I messed up my knee at the end, which is another thing, particularly you, Hartley. That was all your fault. I'm going to blame it on you anyway. But the great thing about working in a D-boy's house, or indeed is that D-boys forget and forgive really easily. And you could literally go mental at someone within 5 minutes. They want to come and have a game of table tennis because it's gone. It's just, you know, don't bear grudges in the same way. And that was liberating. So it was fantastically enjoyable. I loved every minute. Having said that, I'm incredibly glad that I'm not doing it anymore. Because I think 12 years of that sort of unrelenting idiocy is enough to...
have its toll on you. And things happen just when you're at your lowest point. You know, just when you're at that point where you really want to give up, then, you know, as with your year, somebody rugby tackles somebody else into the ground outside the house. And then the phone starts ringing and the world explodes and you just think, oh, that was that was irritating. Remember that one? Yeah, you do. Not naming any names. But yeah, no, it's fantastic fun and an honour and a privilege to look after so many people. Well, 440 boys over the years, so there we go.
Well, it's been an honour and a privilege having you here today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been great fun. Are we got to wind up now?
I think so.
Splendid. Thanks, guys.
Brilliant.
Lovely.
Nice.
I did too much talking there. Sorry.